Hello and welcome to the Book Club Review.
I'm Kate.
I'm Laura, and this is the podcast about book clubs and the books that get you talking.
For many of us, the months in lockdown have sparked a new appreciation of the natural world. People have found solace in growing things, from herbs in a window box to entire gardens turned over to vegetables. Or if, like me, you have black thumbs, then reading books about gardening instead.
Others turn to the simple act of walking, with all its physical and mental health benefits. For me, a long walk through my local wetlands became a soothing daily ritual this past spring, just as the world began to unravel. There's something about a walk where you feel you're accomplishing something, even when you're really just moving from one place to another. It's sort of like reading in that respect. You travel through the pages of a book and feel refreshed.
Reading and walking are great escapes during the COVID crisis, which made us think it was the perfect time to revisit our interview with writer and journalist Emily Rhodes. Since 2012, Emily has been running her successful walking book club on Hampstead Heath, a wild park of woodland and meadows not far from central London. Emily and I met up on a windy day, and she told me about the joys of walking and talking about books, and the book club books that have been hits and misses over the years.
Keep listening for that interview, and while we're on the theme, we'll have some more walking-related reading recommendations.
So Emily, here we are on Hampstead Heath in London, walking along beside a large pond. Can you tell anyone who's not from London, who doesn't know London, a little bit about Hampstead Heath?
Hampstead Heath is massive and green, and it's probably about as wild as London's parklands get, I'd say. It's a place I've always loved. It sort of makes you feel like you're in the country almost, although you're not. You're right next to a train station.
We've just left Daunt Books, which is a very lovely bookshop nearby. What's the connection with you and Daunt?
So I started working at Daunt's about, 7 or 8 years ago. And after a few months there, I started running the little Daunt's up in Belsize Park, which there are two Daunt's in North London. There's one in Hampstead right by the Heath, and there's one in Belsize Park just up the hill. And I was very excited to be sort of running this little shop. And one of the things I really noticed was that a lot of our customers loved Hampstead Heath as much as I did. So I wanted to come up with a way of trying to sort of bring the bookshop onto the Heath. So I decided to start a book club which would take place on Hampstead Heath and would involve going for walks. And it was a great success, and so Emily's Walking Book Club was born.
Okay, so we're just sitting down on a gorgeous spot atop a hill. So this is on your walking route, is it?
Yeah, we walk for about an hour or thereabouts. We meet at the Daunt Books in Hampstead. That's quite a nice spot to meet because all the books are sort of around and the shop feels all kind of buzzy and full of people and everyone's talking about books. And then you sort of cross the road and enter the Heath and you suddenly feel like you're out in the wild. So the idea is you've read the book first and we walk along and I give the group ideas or themes or questions to spark conversations. So we'll have maybe 30, 40 people coming along, and instead of all sitting in a circle and one person holding forth and everyone taking it in turns, everyone just talks at once. So you instantly split into 2s, 3s, 4s and forge on ahead. And after about 10 minutes or so, we get to the ponds that we just walked past and I sort of stop, everyone catches up. I've been flitting about between the different people and try and recap over some of the things that people have said and ideas that have come up in that conversation. Maybe I'll read a little bit out or get someone else to read a bit out and then start everyone off on a different theme. And we come up here, get up to the top of Parliament Hill, stop again, read a bit more out. And so we keep going. We probably have 5 or 6 stops and it works really well. And there's also a lot of reshuffling. So, you know, although the group's been going for about 5 years and there are some people who come regularly and have been coming since the beginning, every month there's a couple of new people. And sometimes people come with another person because they're a bit nervous about not knowing anyone else, and initially they just sort of talk to their friend and I slightly firmly kind of make them reshuffle to meet new people. Because for me, what I think is so brilliant about books is that they're a common ground. And so you can have all these different people coming to the book club who, on the face of it, may have nothing in common, but they've all read this book, and so they can all talk to each other. When it started, we didn't get so many people. The first year was quite hit and miss. Once there was only one person, and she'd never come before, and we had this very intense walk together.
Can you remember what the book was?
Yeah, I do remember the book. It was by Tove Jansson, this amazing Scandinavian writer who wrote The Moomins. She wrote this book called The True Deceiver, and it was about this very intense power struggle between these two women. And we walked across this freezing heath trying to talk about this book. It was, she didn't come back, unfortunately. So there were some low points in the early days, but most of the people who came were very keen on it, and their enthusiasm kind of kept me going. And then it just gathered momentum.
And how do you decide what you're going to read?
Most book clubs work on a kind of democratic system, or I'm afraid this is very much a sort of dictatorship. So many people are telling you to read the current paperback that's just come out, and there are all the reviews, there's all the space in the bookshop, there are ads out, everybody knows about it. But what really interested me as a bookseller and a reader were those books that just looked slightly neglected on the shelf, but that the people who knew would come in and ask for them, or come in and seek them out. And actually one that really was a good instance of this was this book called Westwood the Night by Beryl Markham. Having worked at Dormant for a couple of years, I kept getting people going to the Africa section, because we organise all our books by country, so not just the travel guides about Africa, but memoirs set there or novels set there. They'd always go to Africa, and they'd always get this Westwood the Night by Beryl Markham. And to the point that if someone then came in and said, do you have a book called Westwood the Night? I'd go instantly to the section. I knew exactly what it was. I was really intrigued by it. I was like, what's all the fuss about? What's this random book? It had a terrible cover. I read it, and it was amazing. Beryl Markham was the first woman aviatrix, I think that's how it's pronounced, in Kenya. She had this extraordinary childhood growing up with lions and warriors and riding these horses. It was wild and beautifully written, and it was a brilliant book. And so I wanted a way of getting lots of people to read this book. And as a bookseller, you have a certain amount of ability to do that, because people come in and talk to you and you say, have you read this? And you give them these books. But somehow the book club was a way of getting all these people to read it and all these people to tell their friends about it. And that was really exciting. So yes, it's very much the undiscovered gems of literature, I'd like to think. To start with, I definitely tried to pick out some Hampsteady books. We did Westwood by Stella Gibbons, which takes place on Hampstead Heath, and one of my favourites, which is All Passion Spent by Vita Sackville-West, which, oh my gosh, if anybody's listening, you just have to read it. It's so good, about this 88-year-old woman who decides it's not too late to find her room of her own, and she moves to Hampstead, which back then was not as smart as it is now, and it was seen as sort of terribly bohemian, and she goes for these frail little totters on the heath. So yeah, I did try and choose some Hampstead books, and occasionally we do books where there's a sort of element of walking or travelling or nature. We did Nan Shepherd, The Living Mountain, which is beautiful. We did Laurie Lee As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning. But the majority, I have to say, are actually novels, because I've found that those seem to give the best discussion.
Is there something about the process of walking that you think is important?
Definitely. I find I have my best conversations when I'm walking. I don't know if it's because you're moving and so everything's sort of flowing around your body, or it's the fact that you're looking ahead of you rather than face to face with someone, and you're both looking at the same thing. And there's all the air, and if there is a pause in the conversation, which of course there is, it's not awkward and uncomfortable like it is if you're in a cafe and, it's this sort of pregnant pause. When you're out, you can just look at the trees or, a dog running past, and it works really, really well. And I think people love that walking element.
I think you already talked about something where it didn't go very well, but is there anything that particularly stands out for you as something that made a really good discussion book?
Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple. It's a great book. It's published by Persephone Books. It's quite thick, but you just read it in a blur. Everyone loved that and came up with all sorts of bonkers theories for it. Actually, another one that was quite unusual was Brodeck's Report. That's by Philippe Claudel. It's a really strange book set in this village in sort of on the edges of Germany, France. And it's in this kind of slightly mythical time, but it's all very much about the Holocaust. For me, it was like the ideal situation. Nobody had heard of this book. Everyone got it and everyone loved it and everyone wanted to sort of know more. And for me, that's what the book club's about. It's about getting these books that are really good into people's hands.
And what happens when the weather is terrible? Do you just soldier on? Is it all very British?
We've actually been incredibly lucky in however long it's been, 5 or 6 years. I think we've only had 2 days where it's really poured. Yeah, if it's torrential rain, I don't know what we'll do, but, we'll just sort of work it out, I think.
And do you have any tips for anyone who maybe wanted to start a walking book club of their own?
I would say choose your route first so you don't get lost. And along the route, earmark, 4 or 5 places that are good to stop, with a bench or a view or something like that. And I would say bear in mind that your walk with the walking book club will, if you're walking on your own, it would probably only take half an hour because you'll walk quite slowly and you have lots of stops. So don't be too ambitious in your distance, but find a nice little loop and choose a good book.
Emily, thanks so much for talking to me about your walking book club.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you for asking me about it.
Since I did that interview, I have actually been to Emily's walking book club.
You have, haven't you? What did you read?
We did Black Narcissus by Rue McGodden. I knew Rue McGodden through her children's books, which were kind of much-loved favourites of mine as a child. Miss Happiness and Miss Flower.
Yes, I read those too.
Little Plum, I think we've talked about this before, haven't we? Because you then actually had a Japanese doll's house that someone made for you?
Yes, exactly.
Right.
It wasn't made for me. It was my aunt's, and my grandfather made it for her because she read those books first, I guess, when she was a child.
So, yes, that's what those books are about these dolls in a house and the little girl that looks after them. And to have the doll's house, oh my God, that's how amazing. But she wrote many books for adults, and Black Narcissus is a kind of classic of hers. It's about these nuns who are going to this, what used to be a kind of palace where the local sultan kept his harem. So, a palace of kind of morally dubious background, but which has been then bestowed upon this order of nuns, and they're going out there to set up their mission and to proselytize among the locals and also to do good, to try and bring medicine and education, and they have these very noble ideals, and they go out there and
where is it?
It's set in the Himalayas,
okay.
near Darjeeling. They get out there and they're all kind of fish out of water, and the local man out there who manages the place is this louche, handsome, charismatic individual called Mr. Dean, and the main nun who's looking after them all. And he have this very fraught relationship. But it's about the kind of spiritual crisis that they go through and the way that they achieve a degree of self-knowledge through being in that place and what that does to them all. And it's about the landscape. Rue McGodden lived in India for many years, and so she really knew what she was writing about. It's incredibly atmospheric. And I realised also, actually, there is this really strong thread in it about nature and the natural world. One of the nuns tries to start a garden there. And there is this idea about planting things, what will take root, what will grow, and actually how the place itself resists the foreign influence to a certain degree. It's really fascinating. It made for a really good discussion. And yes, actually walking around the heath and merrily chatting about the themes of this book with strangers who had this incredibly varied range of kind of knowledge and background and things that they were bringing to it. And so it made it really interesting. It was just so nice. It was such a lovely way of connecting with people. So I really loved that and hope to go to another sometime. Well,
it occurs to me that Emily may have pioneered what needs to become the book club of the future, at least for the next, I want to say next few months, but maybe next few years. Right? Because I've been doing my book club over Zoom, and that's all well and good. But actually, I'd quite like to see my book club. I'd quite like to see them in person. And so maybe a nice fresh walk outdoors this autumn is just the thing.
Yeah, and there's something about just walking alongside one another and looking ahead rather than necessarily staring intently at each other. That's quite liberating. I think that was definitely something that I took away from it.
I have a theory that all readers love to walk. It's completely unfounded in evidence. But it just seems to me that the two activities have so much in common. They're solitary, but they feel industrious. They're quite soothing. They allow you to escape. They clear your mind.
Yeah, as a teenager, I actually did a bit of walking and reading on my way home from school. I had a horrible 10-minute walk by a main road, and to cheer myself up, I used to bury my nose in a book as I did it. And that was great, because then the journey passed in no time. And it's perfectly possible, as long as you're not in a busy place, to walk and read as you go along.
Just like the main character in Anna Burns' Milkman.
That's right. See, I really related to that. You know, it's good. And it's a way of shutting out the world that you're in and escaping into the world of the book. But at the same time, you're getting somewhere, which is pleasing.
So we are going to make some recommendations for books that feature walking. Kate, do you want to kick us off?
I wanted to start with The Salt Path, which we discussed not so long ago, which sort of burns bright in my memory because it was such a powerful read. I didn't want to read it. My book club read it. And so it was very much one of those ones where I was like, oh, you know, okay, fine, I'll read it. And of course, absolutely fell in love with it and was riveted to the page. It tells the story of a couple. It's narrated by Raina Wynn. It's her memoir of the things that happened to her and her husband. Through a bad investment they made with a friend, they ended up losing their farm. It had to be possessed in order for them to pay the debt. And so they lost their home. They lost their livelihood as well. And they had nothing. They didn't really have anyone to turn. Their children were away at university, so it was a good thing that they didn't need to provide for their children, but at the same thing, they couldn't really go and impose themselves on their children. And she decided that what they would do is they would take a tent and they would take a few things and they would set off and walk the Southwest Coast Path, which is a 630-mile trail that takes you all the way around the coast of Devon and Cornwall and Somerset. They set off on this walk, and it was really about the terrible time they had, because not only had they had this sort of disastrous life experiences, but they also found out that the husband, Moth, had a diagnosis of a terminal illness. He had a sort of degenerative condition that meant that effectively there was no hope of recovery. They didn't know how long he would have. So reeling from all this you know, appalling news, they set off on this walk. But what's wonderful about this book, and what I actually thought was incredibly almost like appropriate to read in this sort of time of this COVID crisis, was that stripped away of everything else, all their material possessions, all the kind of little luxuries of cozy life, take all that away, and what did they have? They had each other, and they had this trail that they followed, and through that act of walking and spending time with one another, and I suppose the sense of purpose that it gave them, just getting to the next place every day, getting the little bit of money they needed to buy food, it brought them together. And somehow this book is incredibly life-enhancing, incredibly consoling. It really gives you hope. And I think those were the things that I really took from it. And I think millions of others have as well. It's been a huge hit, and justifiably so, I think. It was a really wonderful experience reading it.
You talked about it on episode 65, and I must admit, although, you know, it's about walking, it's the kind of book I should like, I still haven't taken the leap. I guess I'm not quite convinced that this dire set of circumstances they find themselves in will, I don't know, I guess I'm not convinced that there will be enough uplifting sentiment in this story given the dire circumstances. So who knows, maybe one day, Kate.
Yeah, no, it's good. I mean, honestly, I felt the same way, but then I read it. You know, this whole thing about this deluge of books that are all coming out, all these books that have been postponed or held back by publishers because they felt they wouldn't be able to launch them properly in lockdown. Anyway, I see that quietly, I think the sequel, which is called The Wild Silence, has come out. I think that's now available, and that is apparently a follow-on. It takes up from where they left off, where they had found a certain amount of sanctuary, they had found somewhere to live, and you're really left at the end of the Salt Path thinking, oh my goodness, what happens next? So apparently this next one takes the story on, and from the reviews I've read, apparently it has many of the same qualities that I certainly really loved in the first one.
Is there any walking?
I think she might head off down the trail again, but not sure. I got the impression it's not through necessity this time. It's perhaps through a desire to retrace her steps and kind of recapture some of that experience.
Because preparing for this episode has made me realize how much I've always been drawn to books with walking. And in a way, I should have clocked this, because one of my favorite things in a book is a map. Give me a map at the beginning of a book, and I'm like, yes, great.
It's because you're such a fantasy reader, and fantasy readers always have very complicated maps at the beginning, don't they?
Yes. So this has been my epiphany, which is that actually maybe one of the reasons why I enjoy fantasy novels is because there's almost always a quest. There's a journey. You know, that's a real trope, starting with Tolkien, The Hobbit, and Lord of the Rings.
There and back again.
Exactly. And I'm looking at Ursi by Ursula K. Le Guin, which is a quartet of books. And the first one is all about a journey. Patrick Rothfuss, in the second book of his Kingkiller Chronicles, that's a journey. But the book I wanted to recommend, keeping with this theme, is one that I'm actually just about to finish. I'm just about to finish the first book in a quartet, and that is The Gift by Alison Croghan, which is from her Books of Pelennor series. I had never heard of this, but spotted it on Instagram. And you know, I'm a huge fantasy fan, but so much fantasy is really poorly written. And actually, there's a new subgenre of fantasy too, which is kind of like romance fantasy, where actually there's just quite a lot of sex and it's awkward and it's, I don't know, I'm not into it.
Is it as awkward as Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld?
Our latest episode, our most recent book club episode. No, it's not. But you know what I mean? It's very kind of, I don't want to sound snotty because I love a good romance, but it just feels a bit juvenile. Anyway, so when I'm trying a new fantasy novel, I always now get a sample on Kindle. I don't do this with other books, but always with fantasy, just to test out the writing, test out how I feel about the subject. And I was completely hooked by this. On the front cover, it says, an epic fantasy in the Tolkien tradition. And that is true, 100%. It's almost even a little bit derivative, although you can't really call her out for that, given all of Robert Jordan's novels are basically Lord of the Rings again. It's wonderful, and it's really simple and sweet, and we have a journey at the heart. We have Merid, this young woman. She's 16. She's been enslaved in this grubby little camp on the edge of a mountain her entire life, and then she spots this stranger in the encampment with her, but no one else can see him, and his name is Cadvan, and he's a bard. She has no idea what a bard is, but he recognizes her as a bard herself, because otherwise she would not have been able to spot him. So he takes her away. They have adventures. The dark is rising. She may be the chosen one. It has that folkloric fairy tale quality, you know, and you're traveling across a land, a fantastical land. But I've just realized how comforting that is to me. And last night they were in a city for, 50 or 60 pages or so. And I was like, oh no, come on, get out. You need to flee now. The dark is rising. You need to get out of there.
Get back to the countryside.
Get back to the countryside, which is what they're doing. So that's my recommendation. I would be remiss, though, if I didn't also flag The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen, which we discussed on episode 10. And you might recall that I loved it. Not everyone in book club was convinced. I'm just opening my old copy of it and just going to the end papers. There's a map, a wonderful map of China and Tibet and the inner Dolpo Mountains where Peter Matthiessen sets off to find the snow leopard. I love this book. I remember reading it actually when I was buying my first flat, which is always a stressful time, and I found it a real refuge. So listeners, if you haven't read that one, I do recommend it. Although you might want to listen to our episode because not everyone agreed. I mean, he is a very flawed, selfish individual from another era, really.
Who might or might not drive you up the wall. But it was an extraordinary read, and it was a very good book club book, wasn't it? Because it was a very good discussion book. And actually, much of the spirituality and the sense of the power of this sort of essential place, the high Himalayas, really informed my reading of Ruma Godden's book, because I had some sense, having almost travelled through it in my mind's eye at Mathiessen's side. I really then understood what she was trying to convey about the power of this landscape and the impact it had on these nuns. Well, funnily enough, kind of slightly apropos of men striding off on heroic journeys, I wanted to recommend The Old Ways by Robert Macfarlane, which is a bit unfair. I think he doesn't really fit into that heroic explorer mould, but this was the first book I'd read of his. He's had quite a few now and is a sort of very well known for his writing on the natural world and walking, but I think The Old Ways was his first book, and I read it and was just completely delighted by it. He follows these ancient paths, these ancient ways. So it's almost like they're still there, but we've kind of forgotten them now. We've forgotten their significance. But these old drove roads or Roman roads or pilgrimage routes, he traces them out again, and he's using them as a conduit back into the past, But at the same time, obviously, he's walking there in the present day and taking all his thoughts and feelings and experiences with him. Beautifully written, as anyone who's read anything by him would expect. The language is just exquisite, and it's a really exhilarating experience to read his writing, I always think. And it's sort of just got that lovely quality that books about walking have as he takes you through the landscape. The heroic bit, I suppose, comes from the fact that he's very comfortable just flinging down a sleeping bag and sort of sleeping anywhere. Not too worried.
In the rain.
I'm a bit like, ooh, I'm not sure I would do that. But yeah, love that. And then as a counterpoint to the men striding around the countryside, I wanted to flag up Flâneuses. Women Walk the City in Paris, New York, Tokyo and Venice and London by Lauren Elkin, which I read quite a long time ago. So forgive me, listeners, it's not super fresh in my mind. But what I do remember vividly is how much I loved reading it. And I think it's because it's this counter-narrative, you know, the idea that we're kind of familiar with the concept of the flaneur, you know, the man who walks around, you know, sort of 19th century Paris or whatever, gaining inspiration for his work and observing the world around him. And the thing about men is that they're able to do that. They have the freedom to do that. You know, they weren't sort of circumscribed in what they could do in the way that women were. It wasn't possible for women to just wander around the streets, and certainly she would be observed, which is the kind of point of this idea of flânerie, the observing and not being observed yourself. And so she teases out women in history who have walked and who have used those experiences as part of their art, whether it's Virginia Woolf using the excuse of going out to buy a pencil and her journeys through London. And if you think about Mrs. Dalloway is a walk as she sets off with her little errands, but the errands provide her with the purpose that allows her to walk. And then contemporary people, Sophie Calle, the artist, who has done several major artworks which have involved her following people, stalking people. There was one where she follows a man to Venice, he ends up going, and so she follows him there, and she ends up kind of stalking him and just observing him. It's quite creepy in a way, but really interesting in the way that it inverts so many ideas about men following women and turns all of that on its head.
And actually, city walking right now, I suppose in certain cities, has never been better. I mean, that sounds a bit odd. There's less people to observe, but there's more space. London is empty. The city is never going to be like this again. And I know a lot of friends who walked through London in the height of lockdown or cycled through it because it was an experience that they knew they would never be able to have again.
Yeah, I have friends who cycled down to the embankment and saw a seal in the Thames.
Wow.
Couldn't quite believe it. So there you go, the natural world is creeping back. Well, and then I think the real kind of hook with Flâneuses is that Elkin also is relating her own experiences. As a young woman, she travelled quite a bit. She lived in Paris, she lived in Tokyo for a while. Very different experience there because it's such a huge city. It's not actually a city that people navigate on foot. So that's really fascinating. For me, that was a real hook. I was really interested in her own experiences. I loved this book. It was such a kind of magical intermingling of the past and the present, and really nicely written, really engaging, really immediate. Yeah, I think it's a great one. And then my last thing that I wanted to flag up. Now, Laura was grumbling at me earlier because this is slightly off topic, but it's because it's not specifically about walking.
Does it have anything to do with walking?
Not really. But it's about gardening. It's called The Well-Gardened Mind. It's just come out. And I read a review of it by Rebecca Mead in The New Yorker. And I was so entranced by this review, I immediately then ordered the book. And I read it while I was away on holiday. And it is just the most extraordinary read. But I think because it's coming at this perfect time. So I had noticed, as I said in my introduction, you know, I'm no gardener, but I'd noticed that during lockdown I was really drawn to reading things about people who gardened. I really wanted to read about people who understood about plants or who created gardens or who were out in the natural world in some way. And this book kind of explains that. It explains why nature, and particularly growing things, has such an important effect on our psyche. It's a kind of symbiotic relationship that we have, whether we realize it or not, you know, whether we're people who practice gardening or perhaps we can't, you know, perhaps we don't have a garden, or perhaps like me, you just feel like you're not able to because basically everything I've ever tried to grow has died. So this book investigates that psychological link. She is a practicing psychiatrist. She's worked for many years with the NHS, and she's married to a garden designer of some renown, a very successful garden designer. And so she has kind of gone on her own journey with gardening, where in the beginning she used to regard it just as outdoor housework, which I have to say is how I always really thought about it. But then through practicing it herself, she started to discover the amazing capacity it has to kind of soothe us and restore us. both physically and mentally. And this book is a really beautiful examination of that kind of process. And she draws on her clinical practice and on many studies which have been done, which show, for example, in prisons where prisoners have been given access to gardens and they've been taught how to grow things, how that has then affected the likelihood of reoffending once they leave. And also going back through her own family history and her grandfather and his experiences during the war, which were extremely traumatic. He had a terrible experience. He survived, but he was taken prisoner. He was held in a prison camp in Turkey and very, very nearly died. Came back and somehow had to pick up the threads of his life. And she makes a very powerful argument for how it was his relationship with his garden that really helped him do that. And so, yeah, I just don't know how else to describe it. I absolutely treasured the experience of reading this. It felt like every line made sense to me and was something that I wanted to hear and almost something I needed to hear. I found it really soothing. I found it enriching. I am recommending it to everyone I know. I've just bought a copy for my mother-in-law. We were sitting down last night just pulling out different pages, and she was sort of exclaiming how on every page there's something that you read and you think, oh, yes, that really makes sense. So this is the book for me that has made sense of something about how I've been feeling the last 6 months. And I feel, yes, it's not specifically about walking, but it's about greenery. There's a thing about how the way our brains work. They look for patterns in things. The way we make sense of the world, the way our visual cortex makes sense of the world is that it looks for patterns and it decodes the patterns. And apparently it's very good to look at trees, because when we look at trees, it's like we give our brain a rest, because a tree is kind of like a fractal already. It is a pattern. You know?
I love looking at trees.
Exactly. Well, there's a reason why you love looking at trees. It's because for our brains, they can make sense of a tree incredibly quickly and easily, because it's like it ties in with the way that they naturally think. So when you gaze at a tree, you're actually giving your brain a bit of a rest, because it's like, oh, great tree, yep, fine, I can do that. I can make sense of that.
Well, funnily enough, in the spring, my Instagram feed was just filled with photographs of trees, usually, looking up at the sky.
Well, and I've made a point now, even if I'm just driving along, I mean, if I see a tree, I'm like, tree. But anyway, so it's called The Well-Gardened Mind. It's by Sue Stuart-Smith, Rediscovering Nature in the Modern World. It has a quote on the cover, the wisest book I've read for many years, hugely recommended by Stephen Fry, who's kind of the king of the books about the mental state, I suppose. Have you started a garden? No, I want to find someone who can teach me to garden. I feel like I need maybe a retired person.
Well, this is it though, because my mother-in-law is an incredible gardener, and I would say what I've learned from her is you do not need someone to teach you, Kate. You need to learn by doing, which I think is very hard if you're accustomed to learning by reading and studying.
Yeah, that's true.
Trial and error.
Yeah.
Anyway, I will take that recommendation, given that it is tied to greenery. And of course, Emily's Walking Book Club is a book club that ventures through green, beautiful spaces.
Exactly. And there's something, even if you really didn't enjoy the discussion about the book, I warrant that you would have an amazing time, because there's something just so uplifting about being on the heath, which Emily talks so eloquently about, which is in itself just a magical space to be in.
That's all for this episode. For more information about Emily's Walking Book Club, including what's coming up and how to book tickets, check out Emily's website, EmilyRhodesWriter.com. Rhodes is spelled R-H-O-D-E-S. They're currently discussing H is for Hawk by Helen MacDonald, and coming up next is Their Eyes Were Watching God by Zora Neale Hurston.
Books Emily discussed were The True Deceiver by Tove Jansson, West with the Night by Beryl Markham, Westwood by Stella Gibbons, All Passion Spent by Vita Sackville-West, The Living Mountain by Nan Shepherd, As I Walked Out One Midsummer Morning by Laurie Lee, Someone at a Distance by Dorothy Whipple, Beware of Pity by Stefan Zweig, and Brodeck's Report by Philippe Claudel. Laura and I recommended The Salt Path by Raina Wynn, The Gift by Alison Croggan, The Snow Leopard by Peter Matthiessen, The Old Ways by Robert Macfarlane, Flaneurs, Women Walk the City by Lauren Elkin, and The Well-Gardened Mind by Sue Stuart-Smith.
If you haven't heard it already, our latest book club show is on Rodham by Curtis Sittenfeld, a provocative novel that asks the question, if Hillary Rodham hadn't married Bill Clinton, would she be president? we're joined by journalist Phil Chafee to put this bestseller to the book club test.
Coming up next, we'll be discussing The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett. It's the latest book read by both our book clubs and tells the story of two black twin sisters, Stella and Desiree, whose lives diverge dramatically when Stella leaves everything behind to pass as a white woman in 1950s America. It's a remarkable reflection on identity and love, spanning 40 years of shifting attitudes towards race, class and gender. But did it make for a good discussion? Listen in to find out.
If you'd like to see what we're up to between episodes, follow us on Instagram or Facebook at Book Club Review Podcast, on Twitter at Book Club RVW Pod, or drop us a line at thebookclubreview@gmail.com. And if you're not already, do subscribe to us on iTunes or wherever you get your podcast.
But for now, thanks for listening and happy reading.